Welcome to the walkthrough for Unit 1 of Maximum Classics. This first unit of the course, which can be trialled for free, sets the context for learning Latin, points out the similarities between Latin and English vocabulary, but then points out the big difference in how the two languages construct meaning. In this video, we'll take an overview of all the lessons in this unit, including student learning objectives, but also we'll be focusing on the key subject knowledge. At certain points, I'll suggest you pause the video and have a go at some of the student exercises on the screen. So here on the left, we have the Unit 1 page of the Maximum Classics site with all the files you need to teach the unit. At the top of the page, you have the ancillary materials. Then below that are the downloadable slide decks and pupil worksheets. I'll take you through all these resources, focusing on the ones that feature the key learning objectives. That's Lesson 1 and Lesson 5. For Lessons 2, 3 and 4, there's a briefer overview, but don't forget that detailed notes to accompany these and all lessons are available in the teacher guide files. Let's have a look first at the ancillary materials, which you will always find at the top of each unit page. The student workbook is a collation of all of the student exercises in the unit, so you only have to do one photocopier run. The knowledge organizer is a useful one-pager that summarises the core vocabulary, grammar and terms for each unit. Finally, the teacher guide gives a slide-by-slide commentary on the lesson slide decks. It's useful to keep the teacher guide to hand when you're teaching the lessons, especially if you're doing so for the first time. The teaching materials break down into input of ELOs, rehearsal, summary and assessment lessons. Lessons 1 to 3 look at the relationship between English, Latin and Greek vocabulary. And Lesson 4 features a creative exercise using this new knowledge of word roots. Lesson 5 introduces the second LO for this unit, how Latin constructs sentences differently from English. Lesson 6, and the penultimate lesson of every unit, gets the students to record and rehearse the unit's vocabulary. And the final lesson is a rehearsal of all unit learning, followed by a quiz that can be then marked to provide summative feedback. So let's start with an in-depth look at Lesson 1, which explains the point of learning Latin to students. Let's have a good look in detail through the materials. So the inquiry question here is, where does the English language come from? And the objective for the lesson is for students to understand the origins of the English language and the effect of historical events on it. First, let's have a warm-up and see what your students know about Rome and ancient Greece, since we're going to be exploring them a lot in this course. Get them to have a look at these picture prompts and see if they can talk about any of them. In fact, you can press the pause button yourselves and see if you can do the same. The pictures are all described in detail in the teacher guide, but starting from the top left, we have the Roman army, the reason why they had such a big empire. Next to it, the amazing architecture of the Parthenon in Athens, and we can still see columns like this being used in architecture today. To the right of that, some gladiators training, and the Romans love to watch fighting, and we still enjoy watching boxing matches today. Below that, the Trojan horse, and we'll explore the myth of Troy later on in the course. To the left, the goddess Artemis. Again, we'll look at the Greek and Roman gods later on in the course. And finally, to the left of that, the Colosseum, also known as the Flavian Amphitheatre, a huge arena for spectacles and events in Rome. Gory fact: the English word arena comes from the Latin harena, meaning sand. The floor of the amphitheatre arena had to be covered in sand to soak up all the blood and guts spilled from the fights held there. Okay, so now we've had a warm-up thinking about Rome and Greece. Let's see if we can connect it to the times in which we currently live. Let's journey back through Britain's history in a time-travelling spaceship. every time we land, we'll look out of the spaceship window and try and work out from what we see if we're in Greek or Roman times. When your students answer, get them to explain why they think what they do. Right, so we've gone back in time to the Roman Empire. Let's have a look at how big it was at its height. So this map shows all the areas ruled by Rome at its height in 117 CE, and they're all labelled in their Roman names. Can you see Britain? What did the Romans call it? In fact, let's have a closer look at the map. Can you find any more countries where the name of the country is the same or similar to what it is today? Pause the video and have a look. Maybe you have spotted Hispania, Spain, Italia, Italy, Africa, Syria, Germania, and there are many, many more. So if you'd been in Britain in the 1st to 4th centuries CE, you may well have heard Latin being spoken. As we can see, Britain was very much in the Roman Empire. But by the 5th century CE, the Romans were having problems in the mainland European part of their empire, so they abandoned Britannia. In moved the Anglo-Saxons with their very different language, and the only place you'd have found Latin would have been in books or in churches, but not spoken by the average person on the street. At the same time, the Roman Empire split into two halves, East and West, and the Latin language continued to be spoken as it evolved into the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian and Romanian. The western half of the Roman Empire fragmented more and more throughout the 6th to 9th centuries. By the point we get to the 10th century, this is what things look like. And this, or 1066 to be more specific, is when a group of French-speaking Normans decide to take over England as William the Conqueror defeats Harold in the Battle of Hastings. In doing so, he brings the French customs and its language to England, and the language spoken by the Normans is indeed an evolved form of the Latin spoken by the Romans. The English language is a complicated thing. Not only does it have its roots in Anglo-Saxon and French, but it's also picked up even more words throughout its history through interaction with other cultures. We have some words in English that come to us from ancient Greek through the scientific revolution round about the 17th century onwards. So when new scientific phenomena were being discovered or when new inventions were being created. Thermometer, telephone, geography are all words that have their roots in the ancient Greek language. A sprinkling of vocabulary comes to us from Hindi, words like shampoo, jungle, khaki. And we also have a few words that come from Arabic, mainly from trade routes. Words like candy, orange, ghoul are all Arabic origin words. But the majority of the vocabulary in the English language comes from two other sources that we've mentioned. Anglo-Saxon, so the language spoken by the folks who moved in when the Romans moved out in the 5th to 6th centuries. And these guys came from Germany, they came from Denmark, they came from Scandinavia. They give us words that we use in everyday language. They can be a bit tricky to spell, they tend to be a bit shorter. They're like solid everyday words. Anglo-Saxon also gives English its grammatical backbone as well, how we put words together to make sense. But then, of course, we know that the French took over from the Anglo-Saxons after the Norman conquest in 1066, and they brought a different kind of vocabulary to the English language. Words that were a little longer, a little more fancy, let's say. And I'm going to talk about beef and cow in a minute because you're probably wondering why that's there. Let's have a look at how these French words evolved from Latin. So, Anima in Latin is your soul or your spirit. And in French, that turns into animer, to bring to life, and then English, animate. Your pedes in Latin are your feet. In French, les pieds. And then a pedestrian in English is somebody who uses their feet. And one of my favourite little language things is boss. Boss is like a head of cattle, not a cow. Cow is female. Boss is just any kind of thing that goes moo in Latin, which in French turns to bœuf, which then in English turns to beef. Now, interestingly, we only use the word beef now in English to describe the cow when it is roasted or cooked in some way and served to you. And the Anglo-Saxon for that word, cow, is the word for it when it's alive and mooing and making a general stink and a mess. That is because the French were the overlords who got to eat the meat, and the Anglo-Saxons were generally the peasants who had to look after them. So, knowing English words that derive from Latin also means we can use our knowledge of English to make out Latin words. I'm going to show you 4 Latin words. Have a think about what they might mean based on what English words you know that sound similar. First of all, willa. Now, I'm going to say willa because I was taught to pronounce a Latin V as a W sound. It doesn't matter. You can pronounce Latin however you like as long as you make every single sound. Just as a quick aside, in the national curriculum, if you teach Latin as a modern foreign language, you will never be expected to show progression or mastery from your students in oracy or the speaking of the language. So don't worry about it. You can say willa, you can say villa, whatever makes you happy, whatever you're most comfortable with. I'm going to say willa because that's how I was taught. Anyway, quite aside from that, what do you think it means? Here's a little picture clue. So if you said something like house or home, that'll do. Because a villa is still a word we use today, a very specific kind of home, one that we probably would rent in the Mediterranean when we go on holiday, but it's still a word that's used. What about this word? What do you think a scholar is? And again, we give a little picture clue there to help. Of course, it's a school, and it's also where we get the word scholar, meaning a pupil or a student, from. Quite often words that have a CH in them and have a hard k sound come from Greek, as did this word. It went from Greek into Latin. Now, what do you think a finis might be? Another picture clue. If you change that S sound to a sh sound, you get the word finish or an end. And in fact, there are loads of words in English that have F-I-N in them that have a connection with ending. Define, finite, final, finale. There are many, many, many. And last of all, a bestia. What do you think a bestia might be? Well, the vowel sound has changed a tiny bit, but you can probably make out that it means a beast or an animal. So it's at this point that the students can complete their worksheet for this lesson, where they match up English words to their Latin root word by looking for similarities. So pause the video and give it a go yourself. If you had a go, great. Here are the answers. Just as an aside, there is always a matching answer sheet for every written exercise on the Maximum Classics course. So if you want to, you can put this up on the board for students to self-mark. Then, back to the slide deck. So that was the first lesson. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm not going to go into such in-depth detail in every single one of the lessons, but I'm going to give you an overview of the second lesson here. So in this lesson, we look into how another ancient language, Greek, influences modern English vocabulary. So we had a little look at that in the previous lesson, but we explore it a little more here, with a special regard to technical, mathematical and scientific words. This lesson ends up with a similar exercise to lesson 1, where we have a root words matching exercise that you can see there. Lesson 3 takes our language detective skills a step further. After looking at some ways in which Rome and Greece have influenced not just our language but also our culture, we'll take on a more ambitious word roots challenge. Instead of matching up single words, here we're going to match up Latin phrases with their English translation. Students' attention is drawn to clue words underlined that will help them work out the meaning of the Latin mottos on this page, which are still in modern use. Lesson 4 is the last lesson in the unit to explore the similarity between English vocabulary and its Latin roots. And this time we're going to rehearse the learning creatively. So after rehearsal of the learning from the previous 3 lessons, we move on to an exercise that gets the students to invent their own product using Latin roots. The lesson gives the example of a canipute, but prepare yourself for all manner of crazy or possibly sensible inventions. So, lesson 5 is where we look at the second of the unit's learning objectives. For the previous 4 lessons, we've been concentrating on how Latin and English are similar in terms of their vocabulary. In this lesson, we'll be exploring the key difference between Latin and English, the different ways that the languages combine words to create meaning in phrases and sentences. In this regard, Latin is very different to English. As usual, the first slide of the lesson introduces a clear learning objective to understand how English creates meaning using word order and how Latin is different. As an opener to this lesson, we're going to do a warm-up on some of the unit's core vocabulary that we'll have previously encountered in the last 4 lessons. This game, which repeats frequently throughout the course, is called Ecce Centurio, or Look at the Centurion. First of all, go around the board and check the class can remember what these 4 Latin words mean. Hopefully the picture clues will also help them. So we've got Magnus, big, Aqua, water, Optimus, best, and Victoria, victory. Then a pupil can come out to the front of the class and be the centurion. He or she will call out the Latin words individually as orders, which the rest of the class have to obey by miming. You can also use this vocabulary as a stimulus for talking about English derivatives. So, for example, you could ask the students to list as many English words they can think of that have A, Q, U in them and have a connection with water. Now, before we talk about the Latin language, we're going to do an investigation first of how English works. For this, you will need 3 volunteer students. So get them to come to the front of the classroom with mini whiteboards and their markers. Ask the first to write the words "the boy" on their board, the second student to write "gobbles," and the third to write "the ice cream." Then get them to hold their boards up in this order and ask someone from the class to read out the sentence. Then get the class to shut their eyes and imagine the scene that they can see in their mind's eye when they hear or read the sentence, "The boy gobbles the ice cream." Then ask the class to open their eyes and get 1 or 2 students to describe what they imagined. Then, once again, ask the class to shut their eyes, and once they have, ask the students holding the boy board and the ice cream board to swap places. Then get the rest of the class to open their eyes, read the sentence, shut their eyes, and imagine what they can see this time. After a few moments of allowing the class's imaginations to run riot, hopefully you'll have some colourful and creative elaborations on this silly sentence. Importantly though, ask the class to define what has changed between the first and the second sentence. Nothing except the order of the words. Word order is how English makes meaning in its sentences. It follows the rule that the noun that comes before the verb is the subject doing the action, and the noun following the verb is the object receiving the action. We're going to play around with this idea in the student exercise for this lesson. The worksheet consists of a list of duplicate sentences and a worksheet on which to arrange the sentences in different word order. Let's see how this works. So get the student to pick one of the sentences in duplicate from the worksheet and cut out all of the words. First, stick the words in sensible order and copy out the sentence. Then repeat, but with the nouns in silly order. Then to really drive the point home, the students then illustrate the two different sentences. The dog eats the bone eats the dog. Not only are we exploring construction of meaning through word order in this exercise, but we're also familiarising the students with the terms noun, verb, subject and object, all of which will be really useful throughout the Maximum Classics course. However, after this exercise, we have to break the news that while word order is very, very important in English, it really isn't so critical in Latin. Instead, Latin encodes grammatical meaning on the ends of words. We sort of do this a little bit in English. If you see an ed on the end of a verb, it usually indicates it's in the past. And if you see an S on the end of a noun, it usually indicates it's plural. But Latin uses this encoding, or inflection, if you want to give it its technical name, systematically throughout the whole language. Learning Latin is a case of learning vocabulary for word meaning, but also learning these word endings to understand grammatical function. Right, let's just take a quick look at this kind of word ending encoding in action so things will make sense. So let's look at three Latin words: femina, which means woman, amat, which means loves, and vaca, which means cow. If I want to say the woman loves the cow, I can do it like this: femina, vacam, amat. I can reverse the subject and object in English and change the meaning of the sentence. And I could say it in Latin like this. As you will notice, the order of the words hasn't changed. But what has? Can you see? Pause the video if you need a bit more time to look. Hopefully you spotted that when a noun is the object of the sentence, it has an M on the end. A good way of remembering this is by thinking that in English we say he saw me, where he is the subject, but I saw him with the M on the end when he's the object, the thing being seen. A quick note about word order in Latin. Latin does tend to put the verb at the end of a sentence. It's a bit like using a full stop or an indicator that the writer or speaker has finished that particular sentence or thought. But in theory, the verb could go anywhere and the sentence would still make sense. Then, back to the slide deck. Every lesson in the course ends with a plenary quiz consisting of 3 questions. Let's see if we can answer these. So, question 1. After the Romans left Britain, who brought back a form of the Latin language when they conquered England? Can you remember which year this happened? So, of course, it was the Normans or the Norman French in 1066. Question 2. What English word do we get from the Latin word bene, meaning well? Can you think of any more? Well, in their sheet, they would have seen the word benefit, and they may be able to think of some other words. Beneficial, benevolent is an excellent bene word. And finally, question 3. What other languages' influence can be found in English? So maybe they will remember about the ancient Greek words, possibly the Hindi, possibly the Arabic. Let's move on to lesson 6, the penultimate lesson of the unit. And as you'll remember, every penultimate lesson is a vocabulary capture and rehearsal lesson for the unit. For Unit 1, we're going to make the mini dictionary that will last until the end of Unit 8. We're also going to capture the unit's 6 core vocabulary words and then translate these in a part English, part Latin telling of the tale of Achilles. But first of all, let's warm up by recapping the things we learned in the last lesson. Ask the students to read through the sentences and work out which of the colourful words belong in the gaps. In English, word order is very important for the meaning of a sentence. The subject of a sentence is the noun that is doing the verb and comes before the verb. The object of a sentence is the noun having the verb done to it and comes after the verb. And finally, obviously, Latin works differently to English. To find out the meaning of a sentence, we have to look at the endings of words. The mini dictionary template is downloadable alongside this lesson's written exercise. My best advice is to have practice doing this before your lesson. It's pretty easy origami once you get it. There are exactly enough lines under each letter for the words from units 1 to 8. Eagle-eyed students may notice that some letters are missing. This is either because the Romans didn't use these letters, or we're not going to see any words starting with these letters in the first 8 units of the course. Once origami has been done and mini dictionaries are made, you can put in the 6 core vocabulary words for this unit. You may want to check that the students can recall the meanings correctly before they embark on this task. So see if you can recall all of these words. Magnus, big. Aqua, water. Femina, woman. Waka, cow. Victoria, victory. And a little bit covered up by my face here, I apologise, is Optimus, best. Of course, you can always use this slide as an opportunity to talk about English words that derive from these Latin words. Quick aside, don't forget that all of the words featured in all 16 units of the course are also in the audio visual dictionary on the website. You can remind yourself there of the Latin spelling and English meaning of words, and also if you wanted a little guidance on pronunciation. There is also a downloadable version of this dictionary too. Once the students have recorded their vocabulary, they can then go on to tackle the exercise for this lesson. This is a cartoon strip featuring the story of Achilles. Well, a cartoon strip, but it doesn't have any pictures yet. First of all, the students read through the story, which features a mixture of English and Latin words that they've learnt in this unit. The students then illustrate the panel, showing that they understand the meaning of the text. Finally, once all the panels are completed, students can fill in the meaning of the Latin words featured throughout the story and listed at the bottom. This is Unit 1, so there are only a few Latin words in this story, but this will increase as students progress through the units. until by about unit 11, I had to think about that, they will get the whole story in Latin. And finally, as usual, we have the plenary. In English, does the object of a sentence come before or after the verb? After. Question 2. What is the Latin word for woman? Femina. And how did Achilles die? He got spiked in the bit of him that wasn't immortal in his heel. The final lesson of each unit is always a summary of all the unit's learning, plus a short test, which we'll call a quiz, which is then subsequently reviewed together in class. We start the lesson with a summary of everything we've learned in Unit 1. So what do we have first of all? A lot of the English language has its roots in Latin, thanks to William the Conqueror. English words that have a Latin root will have a connection both with the word's meaning and the letters used to spell it. We also get some English words from the ancient Greek language. And harking back to lesson 4, modern inventors, creators and authors still use Latin and Greek words for their ideas and their characters. From lesson 5, we learnt that English uses word order to create meaning, but Latin uses word ending. And we learned a little bit about Achilles, who he was, and you might want to mention how we still talk about the Achilles tendon in modern medicine. And then let's not forget the 6 bits of vocabulary we've learnt in this unit. Aqua, water. Femina, woman. Magnus, big. Optimus, best. Waka, cow. And again, hidden by me, I apologise, Victoria, victory. The students are then given the quiz. It shouldn't take any more than 10 minutes. Each unit quiz attempts to assess vocabulary recall, understanding of grammar concepts, plus decoding novel English words using Latin roots. After the students have done the quiz, the lesson slide deck then contains all of the answers for in-class review and marking. So let's see what you can remember. Magnus we know means big. Aqua, water. Optimus, best. Femina, woman. Waka, cow. And Victoria, victory. In each of these sentences is the underlined word the subject or the object. The dog eats the bone, subject. The farmer feeds the cow, object. The girl paints the picture, subject. The boy ties his shoelace, subject. I can see him, object. And are you going to read your book, object. Because there isn't much grammar content in Unit 1, some of the material being tested on draws on facts and declarative knowledge picked up, hopefully, over the course of the unit. So, the Norman ruler, William the Conqueror, changed the English language. He absolutely did. The Magnum ice cream got its name because it is so small. Total nonsense. Magnus means big. In Greek myth, Achilles was a famous painter. Nonsense, he was a famous fighter or famous warrior. Achilles died by being shot in the arm. It was his heel. And if someone has an Achilles heel, it means they have a fatal weakness. Correct. And the final part of the quiz, matching up some English words that your students may have not seen before to the Latin that gives us that word. So we give them the example of a pedicure being a beauty treatment for feet connecting to pedes. Unique, when there's only one of something, connects to the Latin unus, meaning one. To locate is to find where something is, connecting to locus, meaning place. Canine is to do with dogs because the Latin canis means dog. And to contrast when things are different to each other comes from the Latin contra, meaning opposite. And that's it for the lesson and Unit 1. The class gets a star for its efforts, and there's also a sneak preview of some of the things coming up in the next unit to whet their appetites. So we've got a bit of code cracking with the ends of Latin verbs. We are going to make some monsters out of Greek roots, and we're going to learn all about the gods and goddesses in Greek and Roman religion and culture.